Um, I'd like to give a fairly brief presentation which will try to capture some of the key headlines, as it were, from the research. But behind that, of course, is our 140 something page report, which gives much more detail on all of these, and please do dive into that. And there's a slightly shorter executive summary that you can look at too. So what was the project about? Well, our general question here was, I'm just going to move something off the screen. Our general question here is, how has the pandemic been affecting relations between individuals, communities and the state? And what does this tell us about how things might progress in the future and what can be done? So we conducted surveys in 13 different places and with 3 additional boost groups, extra groups of people. And we repeated these surveys between 3 and 8 times between May 2020 and the end of, well, July 2021. So we have a total of 39,000 survey responses. And in addition to that, we also conducted 61 focus groups and 256 one-to-one interviews. So a very large amount of quantitative and qualitative evidence. To give you a sense of where these places are, first of all, we had 3 contrasting national contexts, which were, you might think slightly curiously, Wales, Kent and Scotland. Why Kent? Well, Kent is bordering Europe, of course, and is sort of rather epitomizes what you might call sort of Brexit Britain. We've done some prior research in these 3 areas, so they seemed a useful starting point. But importantly, we then looked at 6 local authority areas, which had been the cohesion investment areas that were supported by MHCLG, as well as Calderdale, which had independently prioritised kindness and resilience in its own local strategy. So we effectively had 6 areas that were making specific investments in social cohesion. Later on in the series, we also surveyed 4 metropolitan areas, Greater London, Greater Manchester, West of England and West Midlands. And then the other parts of the panels were from our community partners and also boosts of Black and Muslim respondents from metropolitan areas, which was to ensure that we had adequate sample sizes for those. So when we talk about assessing cohesion, we conceptualize this in terms of 2 general dimensions. So the first was how people relate to the state, to government and governance in general. And the second was how they relate to one another as people and as groups. So relationship between the individual and the state includes things like people's trust in their local MPs, their willingness to comply with government rules and regulations, their confidence in government decisions, and their beliefs in conspiracy theories or lack of beliefs in conspiracy theories about the government's intentions. Whereas relationships between individuals and citizens include things like the quality and quantity of their social connections, the trust that they have in other people to respect rules, their engagement in social activities to support others and be part of communities, and their attitudes towards potential outgroups, including migrants. So let's have a look at some of the findings. Starting with trust. So we first of all assessed trust, and we were always focusing in this research on 2 levels, the general sort of UK level and what was happening locally and in the particular places people lived. So we asked about trust in local MPs and in MPs in general. And this quote from my qualitative research captures, I think, what we found. So yeah, I think the local authorities managed it quite well in comparison to national government. National government's been more reckless, more driven by economic incentives and targets rather than people's well-being. Whereas local government, well, I know with us, there was a lot of testing happening, a lot of testing being offered, and there were people volunteering. You could sign up to this paid work to be a COVID-19 ambassador, so helping people to get tested, working in vaccination centres, handing out information. I think seeing that physical presence on the streets, or when you're like in the shopping centres, of people handing out masks, or when you're in a park, you see people handing out masks and stuff, it's really positive signs. So I think you'll see in a moment, this captures some of the difference in people's perceptions of what's happening at different levels. So in this graph, I'm going to show you the ratio of trust to distrust at the local and the general level. So anything above this number 1 here indicates that more people are expressing trust than they express distrust. Anything below it tells us the reverse. And we're looking at two levels: trust in local MPs and trust in politicians in general, the UK Parliament in general. So let's have a look at what happened over this time period from May 2020 through to the end of June 2021. And I think a number of things stand out from this graph. One is that overall levels of trust only went above that number one line really at the beginning of this pandemic in May, June sort of period. And the second thing is that that was only at the local level. More people were distrusting than were trusting in general, in Parliament and government in general, throughout the whole pandemic. But for both of these, there was something of a decline over time. What you'll also see here is that local trust remains much closer to this midpoint line, which means most people think kind of neutral about it. Whereas at the national level, it's clearly always well below that line, which means most people are clearly always more distrusting than trusting. So a difference between the local and the national. What about looking at local competence? How well are the local authorities coping with the pandemic? And here now we're going to look at differences between places as well as differences over time. What you can see here is something quite interesting, I think, which is that a relatively stable flat line in most places. That is to say that perceived competence wasn't varying very much. You'll see that in the local authority areas, it remains quite high relative to many other places. But generally speaking, that's remained pretty steady and pretty level and quite high. And you can see here all the different places where we're collecting survey data from. Now let's look at perceptions of unity and division. And here we're going to look at people's sense of change in division and unity over time. So are things becoming more unified or more divided? And we're going to look at, first of all, how they perceive the UK as a whole, and secondly, how they see their local area. And the paler dots are the ones about unity and the darker ones division. And here again, we can see very different trajectories for the local and national level. So this rather startling purple line here is perceptions of national division, which you can see from June onwards really rocketed up after an initial period of rather low division and high unity, rocketed up and has stayed high ever since. So whatever the pandemic did at the start to national unity did not persist. Looking at local division and unity, we see a very different pattern. First of all, you'll see that this light pink dot, which is for perceptions of unity, as opposed to perceptions of division, remains above the red for most of the way through until we get to December, where they're about equivalent. And basically, a quarter of people say things are becoming more united, a quarter say more divided, but most people are saying things are steady. There's no real change at the local level. Whereas at the national level, people are clearly saying things are continuing to become more divided, and far fewer are sensing that things are becoming more united. So very different experiences at the local and the national level over time. Also rather more stability at the local level. What about divisions between different types of groups? Where are these divisions perceived to be happening? So we have Remainers, Leavers, Scotland, England, UK, Europe, and so on. And here again, we see some quite interesting patterns. So after that initial period of a reasonable degree of unity, things started becoming more divided over time. And although this affected divisions between most types of groups, something different happened with the young versus old division. And notice this change point is around about October. And maybe as younger people started getting opportunities to be vaccinated more, maybe the interdependence between young and old became more apparent within households and so forth. But interestingly, it's not just that all divisions became greater. There was also a sense of some areas where there was growing unity. And I think this intergenerational reduction in division, I think, is quite an interesting and important trend that needs some further investigation. Nonetheless, I think clearly we remain a rather divided nation. What about discrimination? What's going on in people's lives and how people are perceiving it? Well, in general, we found that people were warmest towards older people and coldest towards migrants, which is not a great surprise as a social psychologist. That homeless people and people on low incomes were perceived as being the most disadvantaged. But when we looked at experiences of discrimination, that is, whether you'd experienced discrimination against yourself in the last month, we found, I think, quite shockingly, that 81% of our Black respondents and 73% of Muslim respondents reported having experienced some form of discrimination against themselves in the last month. And that these experiences were more likely for women than for men. And of course, the things compound so that if you're a young Black woman, then you're really very likely to experience discrimination. Not just because of being Black, but because of being at least one of those other things as well, younger and female as well. So I think this is a serious problem, and maybe there's more sensitivity to it following Black Lives Matter, but nonetheless, it's clearly very important for a large number of people, and we need to get to grips with it. Identity and belonging. So how do people feel? Who do they feel they belong to? Where do they feel they belong? How does this relate to place and area? Well, overall, English respondents certainly felt more British than did either Scottish or Welsh respondents. And I think that experience deepened as the pandemic progressed. But all areas felt rather less British as time progressed. So it's a sense of retreat, perhaps. National identification, though, also dropped during autumn of 2020 and continued to do so. So even a retreat from the national level. At the local level, identification did reduce in most places, particularly from September 2020 onwards, but overall it was more stable, and all levels of identity were most stable in the local authority areas. Now, you see my note there, it's counter to statistical expectations. As these are smaller areas and smaller samples, you would expect less stability in those just for statistical reasons. But in fact, all levels of identity remain most stable in those areas, which I think is an interesting finding we want to explore in greater detail. What about the relationships between people on a day-to-day basis? So let's look at neighborhood relationships. Well, here's a quote from one of our focus group participants, interview participants, because before that you wouldn't even know who your neighbor was, and now you're checking in on your neighbors and you're seeing if they're okay, especially the elderly ones, just to see if everyone's okay and if they need anything. So there is a bit more community togetherness, I think. So what was that sense of neighborliness like, and what happened? And again, you can see that initial burst at the start of the pandemic where everywhere neighborliness increased. We were all sort of locked down and waving at each other and banging pots and pans and all sorts of things. But I think interestingly and importantly here, what we can see is the local authority areas, these ones in red, that level of neighborliness started high and remained high, even all the way to June 2021. And you notice it's following the same trends here as in other areas, but still remaining above those other areas. So there's probably, we hope, something about those integration areas and those cohesion areas which has supported that level of neighborliness. Overall, though, the levels are remaining fairly stable wherever people are, and stably different. So lower, for example, in Kent than in other places. So does that investment in social cohesion really make a difference? So does MHCLG's investment and Calderdale's investment make a difference? In June 2021, we have reported on the social cohesion investment before, but not with these latest figures. Respondents in the 6 local authority areas reported, relative to those in other areas, higher levels of trust in national government, greater positivity about their local government's response, closer relations with family, friends, colleagues, and neighbours, a stronger sense of neighbourliness, and they were considerably more active in social engagement. And let's have a look at volunteering, for example. So what you can see here, again, at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of active social engagement volunteering in these local authority areas, and that persisted all the way through. It's always been pretty much double that of other areas. And that's despite the fact the samples are changing slightly over time. We replace people with new respondents. So it's not just that this initial sample was somehow very biased or skewed. And also this is after controlling for all demographic differences as well in the samples. So there is something consistently more positive and more socially engaged about the people in these areas than in other areas. Well, how much does social cohesion matter for managing future challenges? Our belief is that social cohesion will play a vital role in tackling the challenges ahead, and that we need, therefore, a longer-term strategy to build on the lessons learned through the pandemic and to harness the potential of communities, which clearly was manifested in those initial periods of solidarity in most places, but did not persist. And to address the question of how, I'll now turn over to Jo, who will talk us through the 5 recommendations that emerged from this research and report.
Thanks very much, Dom. So I think that we've learned a huge amount from the findings, and the findings themselves are very dense. So I would recommend the report to you, the full report, because I think there's a lot more detail in there, which will perhaps also help you understand how we've reached the recommendations that we're making. We think it's really clear that in order to build connected, kind and welcoming society, we need to strengthen the ties that bind us, especially those ties that bridge between different groups and communities, and also across regions and nations of the UK, because as Dom has pointed out, there are other challenges coming down the line towards us, not least of which is climate change. So building resilience locally and nationally will better enable us to meet and address these challenges. So we think what's needed now is a long-term strategic plan. Our first recommendation is around building greater unity. I think our findings show a country in which people have felt a greater sense of unity and coming together at a local level, but a sense of heightened division at a national level. And some of the feedback from our focus groups is the drivers of that division are economic and racial inequality, North versus South tensions and divergence between the governments of the UK and devolved nations. And at the same time, as Dom has pointed out, our identities appear to be becoming more disparate and complex. And so we think we need a new narrative and leadership that prioritises the interdependence between different communities, regions and nations, that we all rely on one another. And I think this means kind of amplifying that mutual interdependence. So although there obviously are real differences and disagreements, that there's a need for regional and national autonomy and pride in place, we need to focus on those within the broader context of a very strong mutual interdependence, and that everyone has a part to play in building a fairer, inclusive and more integrated British society, and particularly emphasising civility, cooperation and shared purpose. Our second recommendation is around trust, and trust plays a vital role in social cohesion. And trust in national and local institutions and in each other is at the heart of a functioning democracy. It's the essential glue that helps different groups and communities to both bond and bridge across difference. Trust in local government held up more strongly than trust in national government, but not as strongly as trust in other people. And trust was highest in the areas that had prioritised cohesion and amongst volunteers. And so I think this really suggests we need to build trust from the ground up. We think that local government requires the staff, mechanism, commitment and resources to work with communities, groups, business, education, housing, health and civil society locally to develop a shared vision of place and local cohesion strategies. That it needs to strengthen local social infrastructure. There need to be more opportunities for positive shared experiences and high quality connections between people from different groups. For example, our findings indicate that the quality of intergroup contact is 11 times more important than the quantity of intergroup contact. And it also needs to draw on well-established research evidence and application of leadership and good practice from national and local schemes. We were lucky enough to work with some fantastic research partners such as Near Neighbours, Joe Cox Foundation, Volunteering Matters, and I won't name them all here, but there's many good examples of bridging work that brings different groups together, and we think that needs to be amplified and built upon. Our third recommendation is really about empowering local government to build social cohesion and resilience to division, disconnection and tensions. The 6 local areas that have prioritised social cohesion remained more resilient when the crisis struck, and that really came through in the qualitative research. Actually, there was a real sense of communities and local residents working alongside each other with the council, and they maintained high levels of trust, neighbourliness, social connection, and strikingly high levels of volunteering. And we think there's a lot that can be learnt from them. They've already embraced a philosophy and approach that puts local communities in the driving seat. And if you want to see our analysis of their programmes and policies and what they actually did to achieve those results, then please see the policy and practice paper we published in March this year, and we'll put the link to that in the chat because that's got a lot of those examples in there. So we'd really urge DLUHC to build on the success of the Integration Area programme, because it was a relatively inexpensive programme, and invest more widely in strengthening social cohesion at a local level. I think in particular that should include a national framework of local cohesion measures and indicators, because that will support local area efforts and encourage local places to take the lead. And investment should initially be prioritised on those areas that are included in the Levelling Up programme, but it should be rolled out more widely. Our fourth recommendation is in line with lots of others who have talked about the need for a sustained uplift in volunteering. Volunteering is one of the most concrete actions people can take to demonstrate empathy, support and concern for others in their community and civil society at large. And the results on volunteers are striking. They expressed higher levels of political trust, greater sense of neighbourliness and greater optimism for the future. And in local areas which prioritise social cohesion, they were more than twice as likely to volunteer. So we really think this opportunity should be seized, and government needs to work closely with local government and the volunteering sector to provide a comprehensive system of support for volunteering. That includes removing the barriers to volunteering and recognising and rewarding active social engagement amongst residents. For instance, Zara might talk about the Bradford Council Citizen Coin programme, which is a really excellent example. And it also needs to involve strengthening the local volunteering community sector in areas where it's underdeveloped, so that active civic participation is encouraged and maintained. And finally, but by no means least, is around tackling deprivation and discrimination. I think our findings are quite stark in relation to discrimination. There's been a lot of information already about the inequalities that were highlighted by the pandemic and exacerbated by it in some cases. And those kinds of inequalities can really result in cohesion challenges at a local level, including misinformation and rumours spreading about a particular group or community, geographical divides and divisions, and insular hyperlocal groups who are unwilling to mix. But our research has also demonstrated that public perceptions of discrimination are not necessarily reliable indicators of actual discrimination. So we think it's therefore really important to listen to those with lived experience of discrimination and to recognise the cumulative effect of multiple discrimination for some groups and communities. We all need to work together to tackle this. It needs to be proactive, tackling the social and physical barriers to inclusion of minority communities and underrepresented groups, evaluating the equalities and cohesion impacts of strategy and policy at national and local levels, listening to residents' lived experiences of that, and encouraging, supporting civil society and business, as well as all tiers of government, to encourage positive social mixing between groups, because we know that can really improve intergroup relationships and reduce prejudice. So I think in conclusion, we found that local social cohesion can be profoundly affected by national and international actors and events. Decisions taken in Westminster, the Senedd and Holyrood can directly impact social cohesion locally and regionally, and in particular those narratives of us and them. And we need constructive forms of cohesion to avoid pitting one group's pride status or well-being against that of others, just as individuals are protected and strengthened by being part of a supportive community. So communities are likely to be better protected if they are better connected with and concerned for one another. Another thing that came through very strongly in our research was that the majority of the British public want to put aside the divisions and polarisation that has marked British society in recent years. People are really weary and fed up of being at odds with each other, and they desire that greater unity. And we think it's time to invest in our social relations and connections. We need to build resilience to future shock, crisis and change, and protect British society against further division, polarisation and segregation. Thank you.